Good morning. Can I welcome everybody to the 31st meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013 and remind all those present that electronic devices should be switched off at all times while the committee is in session. Our first item today is to take evidence on the Scottish Government's proposals to amend the Children and Young People of Scotland Bill in relation to school closures. The Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning wrote to us in September telling us that he intended to lodge amendments on a number of issues to do with school closures. Today we will hear first from stakeholders in order to inform our scrutiny of these amendments when they are formally lodged, and then we will hear from the Cabinet Secretary. Can I begin this morning's session by welcoming to the committee Clellan Snedden from Argyll and Bute Council, Leslie Manson from the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, Malcolm Burr from Western Isles Council, Eileen Pryor from the Scottish Parent Teacher Council, and Sandy Longmuir from the Scottish Rural Schools Network. Good morning and welcome to all of you. We're going to move immediately to questions from members, and can I begin by asking Liz Smith to start us off?
Thank you, Convener. I think all of us who were involved at the time in 2010 would hold up our hands and say that we didn't get the legislation correct, particularly when it comes to the presumption word. I wonder, just given the evidence that you have each presented to us, I still think there is a very considerable difference of opinion about this. Could I ask, if we do include the phrase presumption against closure, do you believe that that will clarify matters, or do you still think that that is going to be open to very considerable question?
Who wants to start? I'll just pick if you don't volunteer. Sandy.
Yeah, how easy you go. The presumption, whether or not it actually helps, will depend a lot on what the policy is that backs it. But I think the recent decisions in the Court of Session have found that the matters to regard have been left kind of hanging there in terms of who actually decides whether or not the matters of regard have been properly addressed or not. Whether the community factors have been properly addressed, whether attempts have been made to remedy any foreseen problems before the schools come to a consultation. We've seen representations saying that the presumption is too far, that it will go too far, that it will make communities somehow mistakenly in the belief that no school will ever close. A legal presumption, that's not what it means at all. If you take the most simple legal presumption there is the presumption of innocence. Nobody believes, the general public does not believe, because there's a presumption of innocence, that nobody will ever be found guilty. What it does say is that there must be a considerable body of proof which outweighs that presumption of innocence. And that's exactly what we're looking for here, is that there should be a body of proof put forward to say that the matters of regard have been dealt with, have been assessed, any attempted remedial action has failed or would be impossible. It would never succeed. As long as that can be demonstrated, then the presumption will fall, just like it does in any other legal aspect. I mean, the Scottish Government are currently consulting, I think, on a presumption in development, in terms of sustainable development, and that's to catch up with a presumption which currently exists in England and Wales and operates. I can't see any problem with introducing the words presumption against closure into legislation.
I think that, we've somewhat sidestepped the question in our response, because I suppose our key issue is around what is a rural school and how are we defining a rural school, and what are the issues that make a rural school a rural school. Because we know that you can be in South Lanarkshire, 2 miles away from another village, and be in a rural school. To us, that doesn't make any sense. Whereas if you're in Neudart and you're 50, 100 miles from your nearest school, I would say that's pretty rural. So, I think there's something about, you've got to actually start with the base point of what are we calling rural. And I don't know how that's done. I'm not going to set myself up as an expert to do that. But I think we've really got to have clarity about what we're defining as a rural school, and then perhaps look at, that Neudart school. Is there a presumption against closure for those types of schools which are absolutely isolated and which are so different, as I say, from the example that we gave of the South Lanarkshire schools. So, as I say, we've somewhat sidestepped the question directly, because I think there is another one behind that that has to be answered.
Thank you, Chairman. It's my view that the word presumption is somewhat unhelpful here. I think it does create an expectation in the minds of many that it's a very, very high bar, and that is simply not the case. As Mr Longmuir said, any presumption can be rebutted. And I think what we're talking about here are policy choices. It's not a matter that the presumption of innocence argument is there, but we're not talking about liberty here. We're talking about policy choices. And the Act provided some very good tests, and if these are applied correctly, they give the necessary safeguards. I'm just not clear what the sense of presumption adds to what is an objective process. It should be an objectively arguable process in both procedural terms and in the sense of merits, by which I mean has a council gone about its job correctly, and have indeed Scottish ministers gone about their job correctly. So I'm not clear what introducing a term like presumption really adds to the process for anyone.
I mean, one of the issues, if we do set a very high bar, then it raises, I think, the attempt in all parties to ensure that we were doing things absolutely correctly. And one of the things that's been pointed out very, very strongly in two panellists' evidence is that because it hasn't been clarified in the existing legislation, it's been very open to misinterpretation. And the facts, just as you've said, objectively, the facts have not actually been correctly assimilated. In fact, in some cases, they've been quite plain wrong. And that has been very much to the detriment of what was the 2010 Act, and we're trying to move forward on that. What I'm trying to drive at is that a matter of ensuring that it does go into legislation very clearly as a legal definition, if you like, or whether we have to do a bit more than that. That's really the nub of the question for me.
I think the fact that the Act provides for special regard for rural schools and rural factors, that, to my mind, says it all, and that's where it should be left, because Parliament is then saying that is the intention, that rural schools have a separate set of criteria which councils must properly address. That, to my mind, is sufficient, because this is about evidence. This is about going about the process correctly and and giving consideration to what the Act requires, and I personally think that's sufficient. The presumption is there, if you like, within the rural factors.
But there's a difference between intention to have special regard and something actually being in the Act. I think that's the point that some people are trying to make about this, that in order to raise the bar and to ensure that we're doing things absolutely accurately, we do need to have that extra confidence, if you like, in the terminology. Because I think, what we've all found, and as I say, we're all guilty of not getting the Act right the first time round, is that it has been open to misinterpretation. And that's why we've seen some very lengthy legal disputes and some difficulties for local councils and obviously for the Scottish Government.
Yes, I must. And my own council, as the committee will know, was involved in that legal action, and the court found, as you know, that there was in fact no statutory presumption. I don't think that affected the council's consideration of our school closure programme. We looked at the special factors, and that I can't go beyond that. It is an objective process. It's a process of assessment. And it's even a little illogical to put statements of intent like presumption into that when it should be argued on process and merit.
Sorry, how do you mean illogical?
Presumption, I would say, is more of a political statement than is strictly consistent with a process like this.
I'm maybe being very stupid here, but I don't quite follow that. Could you just explain what you mean there?
I'm saying the Act rightly defines the process which councils have to follow. The court has clarified that there is a consideration of merit in any subsequent review of that. These are objective factors. A council has either properly considered these rural factors or it hasn't. You take how a statement like such as presumption against closure is fed into that objective process, I think could be unhelpful. At what stage, for example, at what stage is that considered? Is it considered at all stages?
Right.
How then does the Minister consider it? If he thinks the Council has gone about it procedurally correctly, if the merits are there, does the presumption then come in? I just don't think it adds. I appreciate the intention, is that there is the political intention behind this. I'm just not sure it adds much to help anyone.
Convener, may I just have one more question?
Bring in Leslie and Cleland first, because we haven't had a chance to hear from them yet. Leslie first.
Thank you. I'm not sure that the term presumption helps. I think the semantics are important here, because I think it's a term that's frequently misunderstood. I think for many parents and members of the community, it means that there's no possibility there'll ever be a consideration of their school closing, or if the local council has the temerity to so consider, there'll be a likely veto from a higher authority. And I think it gives a sense of protection that's inappropriate. However, the fact of a presumption, if that can be enshrined in law, I believe is useful. And as has already been said, it would suggest that the consideration is such that the closure of rural schools are a rare event, and that the special rural factors will be taken into consideration. And when you're looking at options then, I think it's important that, for example, the status quo is always considered as an option, and I'm not sure that has always been the case. And more than that, I think the amended status quo, so to speak, the ideas that parents and members of the community might have, suggestions, contributions that they might bring to the table that could move a school from being regarded as non-feasible to feasible. I think that if you can capture the presumption in the terms of the Act, that would be useful. I'm not sure the word itself is helpful.
Is it just, sorry to interrupt, Liz, but I mean, is it then the case that your position, Mr Manson, is that as long as the word presumption is clearly defined, then you don't have a particular problem with it? It's the definition that's the issue.
No, I mean, as we said in the submission, it's for government to presume as it chooses. That's the role, I believe, of government. And more than that, living and working in a rural community, I also presume that the rural schools aren't closed. So if your starting point is that this is going to be a very, very rare occurrence, then I think that's acceptable.
Yeah, as the fifth to speak, I'll try not to repeat myself or repeat comments that have been made. There's a couple of interesting points that came out of this. Our written submission came from the premise that there was going to be a proposal brought forward to clarify the presumption, and we welcome the clarification of that presumption. So maybe taking the argument on a step from some of the earlier contributions. The key aspect of this is how it's articulated. There was a misinterpretation of the presumption that was in the 2010 Act. It did imply to some people that that was an immovable barrier to the closure of a school, and I was encouraged by the words by the Scottish Government to ensure they wouldn't articulate the presumption in such a way as to stifle legitimate changes to schools that become necessary over time. And I think if there is to be presumption retained within the Act, then it's incumbent on us to ensure that it's articulated clearly enough so that there's an understanding from all parties about what that means. So hopefully that's a helpful contribution, but it does echo some of the comments from earlier.
Liz.
Just finish on that, just picking up the point, Mr Snedden, on that very issue about whether you think that, broadly speaking, the recommendations that have been made by the Commission do get the right balance between safeguarding our schools and also allowing councils to reform and ensure that there are the right schools in the right areas. Do you think that balance has been broadly struck?
I I think generally the recommendations, and I'm talking in the wider sense now from the Commission, are welcomed. There's a very interesting point that Eileen mentioned earlier, which is that presumption takes an awful lot of our attention, but there are a series of underpinning questions and arguments in terms of what amendments to the legislation can be taken forward that are arguably more important. And we have set out within, without jumping the agenda, we've set out within our submission some of the key considerations for our authority, and I'm sure in common with others, around how that legislation is implemented. Leslie is quite correct. None of us entered into local government service to be the person closing rural schools, but we have a responsibility in terms of how we use finite resources, and the fortunes of communities wax and wane, and we need to ensure that we have the right provision in for our communities, and we adjust resources accordingly, and that sometimes means difficult decisions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Bird, does it give you any comfort that in the Cabinet Secretary's letter to the committee, he stated that the presumption against closure should not mean that no rural school can ever close, but that very careful consideration should be given before making such a proposal, given the significant impact it could have on the community involved?
Yes, it does, and that is picked up in government's response, and I'm just reading from that. The Education Authority must give very careful consideration to the matters of special regard before bringing forward a closure proposal, and I think any competent council would do that before any closure proposal was even thought about. I suppose that is as it is. I would say it shows that adding the words presumption against closure, if that is all it is about having special regard before a proposal is brought, it doesn't add very much to the amendments to the Act. Arguably not, if that is how it's defined, and if it is clearly stated in those terms, then it adds very little and hence doesn't do any harm. But I do feel there is it's more for parents and communities, I think, who might feel that this is an almost irreversible ban. I appreciate that's not what government is saying. No, it's not what it's saying. I appreciate that, but I question what it adds. But if it's clearly defined in those terms, then yes, then that would be helpful.
Sandy.
Yeah. What I think it adds, and what we hope it would add, is that the matters to have regard at the moment can be a procedural matter. In terms of the law, it is up to, at the moment, it's up to the Council to say we have had regard to these three matters, and it is them to decide the weight that that's given to it. If the presumption is put in place, if the presumption operates the way we think it will, or hope it will, is that the matters to regard will have a higher prominence, that they will have to be demonstrated that they've been met. And the presumption will just simply add weight to that. That's all we're asking for, is a weight of evidence thing, not as as is being said, that no school should ever close. Simply that the weight of evidence has to be substantial.
Liam MacArthur.
Thanks, Convener. Just picking this up in terms of whether or not it adds anything or is potentially counterproductive. I mean, one of the issues, is it not, with the current legislation, is that it is interpreted differently by different people, and that there is a risk in raising expectations, not necessarily amongst those who live and breathe it, but those who have the misfortune to engage with it at the point where they need to engage in it, that their expectations are raised unduly. And I'm thinking, particularly in terms of the 2010 Act, there has been suggestions that, for example, financial considerations shouldn't come into play in terms of a decision around school closure, which I think to anybody who has had any involvement in this is simply nonsensical, because why would a council go into a process of even considering it were it not weighing up, to some extent, financial considerations? So is it fair to say that by putting presumption actually on the face of the bill, that you'd really rather not, but it wouldn't do any harm? Is it not fair to say that actually the potential for this doing harm is significant, in that we simply go on raising expectations about what the legislation will actually do at the end of the day?
I think that is a risk. As I said to the chairman, though, if it is defined as giving careful consideration to matters of special regard before the proposals are brought, then, as I say, any competent authority would do that. But it must be, if it is to be there, it must be very carefully defined. I think otherwise there is the very risk to which you refer.
I mean, I would say that the language of the layman is such that presumption, well, what does it mean to the layman? It means we presume this will not close, this school will not close. The same as the presumption of mainstream. We presume that children with additional needs will be in mainstream schools. So, you know, people have an understanding of the word, and I would be concerned also about the point that you make, that it is an unrealistic raising of expectations. And again, the point that you make that actually you're talking about groups of people who will only engage with the process when they have to, not local authority officers or whoever who are dealing with it day in and day out, but the families and the communities who will only engage with this process when it's their school, which has been considered for closure. And it's a very tough notion to explain to people, and it's emotionally charged. The whole process is emotionally charged for communities, and I think we've really got to guard against giving those false expectations.
I can assure you that any policy memorandum will be avidly read by any parent that comes up against the Act. Absolutely avidly read. And in general, rural parents are not simple by nature. They are very quick at picking up and understanding even the most complex of documents. I think we sell the public short, but by saying that if we put this clearly worded in a policy memorandum in backing up the presumption that the public will not be able to understand it, I think that's actually insulting.
I just, my understanding of the word presume is that if I presume something won't happen, it doesn't mean I believe that it won't happen. I believe it's kind of unlikely, but at the same time, you know, there are reasons why things mean that that will happen. I mean, I don't take the view that because I presume something that it's an absolute. So, I mean, I don't. Eileen, Sandy, hang on. As Eileen, I wanted to ask Eileen about this because you seem to be suggesting that people, because the word presume or presumption is there, that people will take that as an absolute position.
Well, I think people are optimistic by nature. People are optimistic. They presume. They then become optimistic that that presumption will sustain. And I absolutely agree with Sandy, and I would never ever suggest that that the layperson is ignorant or stupid. And there are absolutely folk out there who will crawl over the legislation. And I've done it myself as a parent. And you do it when you need to do it. But the problem is that you only do it when you absolutely have to, and you perhaps are not as familiar with the background and the legal position as you might otherwise be. And clearly Sandy's group will support parents who want to do that work, and that's great. But I'm simply saying that because we are all, or most of us, by nature optimistic, then we take presumption as being a very positive thing. And we will travel optimistically.
Thank you. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Morning. The Court of Session found that the 2010 Act currently requires Scottish ministers to consider the merits of a school closure proposal as well as the process undertaken. All those responding to the consultation on amendments to the 2010 Act supported the consideration of merits by Scottish ministers. However, SPTC suggested that the primacy of the local authority as a locally elected body must be respected, and the Western Isles Council suggested that it should not be for Scottish ministers to substitute their decision for that of a council solely on the basis of policy preference. So with that in mind, I'd be interested to hear your views on what level of merit consideration it would be appropriate for ministers to pursue.
Malcolm.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I think the court, what the court said was it was impossible to assess process without having some regard to the merits, and I think I do think that was absolutely correct. The court was very clear, though, that as you've noted, that matters of educational provision were primarily for a council. And circumstances, to quote from them, circumstances in which central government can step in and deprive a council of its power to close a school should be very limited. But in terms of the merits, I think what was clearly meant was that, given there is a call-in procedure, it is logical that ministers look at how reasonable a council has been, by which I mean, has it taken into account relevant considerations, or has it taken into account irrelevant considerations? Has it been fair? Has it addressed the matters properly that parents and others and communities have put to the council, to those who are opposed to the proposals? And that's what the court did. It assessed these. It took them. It took in my own council's case vast amounts of documents, etc., and assessed them. And that, I think, is what is expected of ministers, that no one should be able to say, your council did not look at my arguments or answer them, provided they were legally relevant, of course. You took into account factors that weren't relevant, or, to get back to the financial point, gave undue weight to factors that were not educational. I think that's an important point, and I welcome the clarity that the amendments seek to give on that matter. Councils primarily look at these things for educational benefit and educational purposes. So I think that's what's meant by merit. It's not an absolute rehearing of the case. That's very clear, but it is a check that the merits have been properly addressed.
I think that our perspective is that what we want from local authorities is that they use the process properly. And you know, we certainly hear from parents, not frequently, but fairly regularly, that the process has not been operated properly. And so, you know, we would say there has to be a process, it has to be a robust one, and local authorities have to stick to the rules, actually, and they have to do what the legislation says. So that's kind of number one. And the second point, I suppose, is that people in our communities elect their local authorities. They elect their local authorities to make these decisions. Sometimes they agree with them and sometimes they don't. But that is their job. And, you know, and I don't think we should be depriving folk of their jobs. So, you know, it's really a fairly simple argument. Do it properly, do it well, do it thoroughly, take into account the views of all of those who have a stake in this. And you know, we make the point that parents who have exercised their choice to take their children out of a school and move them to another school, at the minute their voice isn't being heard in this process, and we think that's wrong because they voted with their feet. You know, their opinion is important. Why have they done that? So that's some kind of qualitative perspective there that at the moment we're missing. But, you know, it is for local government. So these are not decisions that should be made by national government. These are decisions that should be made at the local level, and local politicians are accountable for those decisions, and that is how we operate. That's how it should be.
Just one second, Tony. Can I just follow that for a second? I mean, yes, I agree. I mean, effectively, you know, that's why we have local democracy. That's what it's for. But surely you would accept, Eileen, that there was a groundswell of view amongst lots of communities. I mean, I dealt with a school closure proposal in my area, that they felt that local authorities were not dealing with the matters correctly or reasonably, and in some cases even legally. So, I mean, clearly there was a problem. I mean, I think we all recognised that problem at the time, and therefore, much as it would be fantastic to always leave the situation in the hands of local councils who are absolutely responsible for this, there was a view amongst the public, which obviously came through the Parliament, that, in fact, a set of rules had to be put in place to try and manage this process.
And I would agree with that. Absolutely.
Right. No, so it's not entirely the case that local councils should take decision in national Parliament. The Scottish Parliament should not be involved.
I suppose our utopian perspective is that this should be done properly at local authority level. And if it is done locally at local authority level, then there should be no role for government. You know, other than kind of last resort.
If we ever manage to achieve utopia, then
come back to me.
Perhaps
come
we'll
back
discuss
to
it
me.
then. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, others. Thandi, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, were, as the Spice briefing says, we were one of the organisations who were confused in the original development of the 2010 Act into believing that the material consideration element of the Act actually meant the merits of the case. And the Spice briefing says that, that some people thought that the call-in would only refer to procedure, and other people believe, because of any material consideration, that it would also refer to. And we were actually quite pleased that the law lords came to the same conclusion, that you can't separate the two, that if there is a matter of substantial concern, that the minister should have to take cognizance of it. We've seen so many cases, I mean, we give so many example after example, especially in the financial sphere, where information has been presented to elected members which has quite simply been wrong. There's information has been in proposal papers which is quite simply wrong. Now, if that's voted on, in some cases it's not the elected member's fault that they are voting on wrong information. But if in that case, there has to be some kind of appeal mechanism whereby people can say, no, OK, the process was followed, the meetings were held on the right date, the proposal papers went on the right date, they were sent to the right people, but the information was completely wrong. And so, therefore, the merits of the case don't stack up. I mean, we are quite content that merits are to be considered.
Yeah. Maybe reflecting back on some of the experience we had around the process, I'm encouraged by the indications that going back to 2010, everyone thought that the call-in would be by exception. It would be very seldom used. I'm encouraged by some of the advice that we are receiving now that the focus will be in ensuring there is support for a local authority throughout the process to minimise further the call-in. The one thing I would say is already from some of the submissions or commentary around the proposed amendments to the Act, there are some who will look at the retained call-in as a means to try to have every proposal called in. So the emphasis is very much on the process as we go through to ensure that all the matters of due regard are considered, that the proposal documents are as comprehensive, accurate, robust as possible, that the engagement with communities is as proactive as possible, notwithstanding it's very emotive. And if that process works, and within the proposals there is discussion around the role of Education Scotland, the role of an independent referral mechanism, and we wait to see what that shapes up and looks like. But it would be extremely important for us to put the emphasis at the front end of the process rather than look at the retained call-in as something that communities will continue to use on every case because they view it as an opportunity of getting a local authority decision overturned. Now, that's a fairly blunt way of presenting it, but that type of opinion about the call-in is still present. It goes back potentially to the discussion we've had around presumption. And it's something that a clear articulation within the revisals to the legislation can be used to clarify the position for communities.
Just very quickly, Convener. So I'm presuming then that witnesses agree with the proposal to remit a closer decision back to the local authority. Okay, thank you.
A very welcome point of clarity and agreement there from everybody. Thank you very much. If I can move on now to Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to ask you about the independent referral mechanism, and just to follow on from what's previously been said, to get your thoughts on the independent referral mechanism, and also, given what's previously been said, to ask why you believe people would wish decisions about their schools and their communities to be taken by people they have no role in appointing, and a body that's unanswerable to local communities.
Cleland. I'll maybe start because it follows on from what I previously said. Decisions around school closures should and will be made by local government. This is about ensuring where there is a concern around a decision which has been made has an opportunity to be reviewed. And there was a view that the existing process was potentially political, or was open to being political. And there is a consistent call throughout our dealings since 2010 where such proceedings were taking place for them to be independent. Now, we talk about Education Scotland's role at an earlier stage in the process, and we are quite clear in our submission, yes, potentially they do, but some of the assessments around merit inevitably are subjective in nature. So you look for people with the appropriate credibility and professional background to make those assessments. Similarly, for the independent referral mechanism, whatever that body will be, you will look for it to be seen to be independent, you'll look for it to be seen to be transparent, you'll look for fairly quick turnaround on decisions. And finally, you don't want to create a new bureaucracy and have a very expensive process. So if all of those aspects are delivered as part of the amendments to the legislation, then I view it as a positive development.
Yeah, I think there's a well-tried and tested system now whereby, for example, in the General Teaching Council and in Education Scotland, those who make the rules, so to speak, aren't those who adjudicate whether those rules have been adhered to. There's a separation between policy making and adjudication as to adherence to policy. And I think that's well understood, and I believe it's liable to less legal challenge if you do separate those roles. I think the idea that people can exercise considerable influence without being directly appointed is accepted right across the land. I mean, our health boards aren't locally appointed, for example. There's a whole system of public appointments to, you know, some really influential and responsible bodies and individuals that have nothing to do with the local democracy as in MSPs and councillors. That is view is that in the same way as councils can be deemed to have got it wrong, so to speak, it's also the case that Parliament, for political reason, may have got it wrong in specific areas, and it's probably the you know, best to remit that to an independent body whose job isn't to determine the merits of the case, whose job is to determine whether the politicians and the policymakers have done their jobs properly. In other words, have they considered fairly the merits of the case? Have they followed rigorously the process? That's what they're adjudicating on. And I think the separation between the call-in process and the final adjudication should be clear for all to see.
I think there is an issue of principle about why this particular aspect of service provision, i.e. schools, is subject to further procedure. I mean, and one could talk about whether that reflects the parity of esteem between central and local government that the Scotland Act spoke of in 1998, but I appreciate that is not a view that is shared. It wasn't a view that was shared by the Commission, of which I was a member, and there is a clear consensus, I suppose, that there should be a further review of Council's decisions on school closures. So on that basis, I think the independent referral mechanism is one way of doing it. It doesn't really matter from my perspective as long as there is clarity as to what either ministers or the referral body is doing, and that is, as Mr Manson said, reviewing the procedural competence of Council's decisions in the sense of whether there was adequate evidence and whether that evidence was properly weighed. Whether that is done by an independent body is not so important, provided there is clarity and from that clarity there's confidence for everybody involved in the process that the decisions are properly taken.
I would simply say, echo what Mr Burris said. You know, I think that there is a very well-established system in various aspects of our civil society of that kind of independent body who will review the process and review that everything was done as it should have been done. I don't see any problem with that. And you know, I go back to the point about this should be a decision. We should be talking about a local authority decision. And if that process needs to be reviewed, then that should be reviewed independently. It should not be a political decision.
I think we're all pretty much in agreement.
Sandy, it's not
No,
absolutely
well,
necessary.
I would just like to say the same thing is that in public life there are so many aspects of things. Even a simple freedom of information request, if refused by a council, you have the right to go to appeal. A planning application, you have a right to access to a reporter. I mean, it's quite accepted in public life. What I would like to say is it's all about transparency. It's not about who is appointed, it's about how they act when they are appointed. It's all about taking the information that's presented to them. And parents will. We quite accept it that some parents trying to hang on to the last minute will ask for call-ins on quite spurious matters. But they can be quite easily disregarded. It's just a sifting mechanism to find out the ones which actually should be brought forward to an appeals process.
In terms of, you said right of appeal is quite normal. Do you, and particularly to the local authorities here, do you think the decision of an independent review mechanism should be final? Do you think local authorities should be able to appeal what the independent review body has decided, or should that make the matter final and closed?
I'm not a lawyer, but it would be very difficult to create a mechanism whereby you could not have an appeal to the Court of Session. It would be full and final in that you would have nowhere else to go. I mean, you couldn't then go to ministers or, wherever. But I think, again, not a lawyer, but I would think that there would always be access under basically the Wednesbury rules, saying that somebody had acted totally unreasonably, that a local authority could appeal even an appeal panel decision.
I think in the interests of all, Chairman, that there is indeed that right of appeal to the Court of Session, but that should only be an appointed law, yes, in order that the process can be concluded in a reasonable time.
Thank you. Yeah. It was just if the panel agree with the independent review determining or reviewing the decisions, and it's introduced, why then do you think Scottish ministers need to be involved in the process at all? I mean.
That's right. I think the answer's quite clear. But anyway, Cleland.
You mentioned earlier that the difficulty that it could be seen as a political decision, and the independent review body could.
Without repeating ad nauseum, the same issue for me is very clearly about how this is articulated. Yes, Mr Longyear mentioned that certain spurious grounds for appeal can be disregarded if they're clear around that kind of process. It's about setting a reasonably high bar, and that high bar comes from the earlier part of the process where there will be a closer relationship between Education Scotland and the local authority in terms of ensuring what goes into the public domain as part of the actual proposal is robust as possible, that the consultations carried out as robustly as possible, and that ultimately the decision that the Council faces is as well informed as possible. And if that element is achieved, then it needs to be quite a significant kind of step up to occasion a referral to ministers. If ministers then accept a call-in is due, as opposed to reverting it back to the local authority to address some matters that they believe to be outstanding, and ultimately goes to an independent referral mechanism, it should be very few that reach that far stage in the process. I think so far, and I maybe get the figures wrong, something out of 85 call-ins, only 9 have been refused, if that's the kind of proportion. This greater emphasis on the diligence around the earlier part of the process should reduce that further. So I would expect only a handful to go on to an independent referral mechanism, as opposed to taking all potential requests for appeal and putting it straight to an independent referral mechanism.
With all due respect, I think Mr Bibby's question was, though, if you have an independent review panel, why do ministers have to be involved at all? You've explained the process and it would be rare, etc. But I mean, what's the point of ministerial involvement if you have an independent panel?
Again, going back to what I understand is being proposed, the ability to revert proposals back to local authority to try and address them before a formal appeal is is referred to an independent referral mechanism means that very few would get to that end point in the process. So I think there is a role for the Scottish Government's officials to work with local authorities to try and ensure that if there are matters that are outstanding that can be relatively straightforwardly cleared up, then it is not referred on further and using up the time of an independent referral mechanism.
Leslie?
I think a sequence of SEFTs or considerations is always viewed by the public as being a more rigorous and thorough way to consider their cases. And I also think that inevitably communities and parents are going to go to national politicians anyway. You, after all, are the lawmakers. It's going to come your way one way or another. So it just makes sense to, on the one hand, to then produce the additional SEFT, because you know, from the 85 closure proposals, I can't remember the numbers, 20 or 30 or so were called in. There's a SEFT, and then a further 9 were refused or turned down. So a series of SEFTs is a good thing, and it's coming to the national politicians anyway, so make them part of the SEFT.
Isn't the problem here, I mean, effectively, to contradict the question I've just asked, is that if there was no government involvement, then effectively it was all down to the independent review panel, then effectively somebody who has to decide what gets called in. And effectively then you've got the people who are calling it in also reviewing it. Isn't that the problem? And that's why ministers have to be involved. I mean, I suspect, my view is that ministers calling it in and then a separate independent body taking the review decision, to go back to the discussion earlier, it separates out that decision process, I presume. Yeah. Okay, can I just move on? I know I'm certainly concerned about time, but we've got a few other areas we want to cover. Liam.
Trying to tee up Malcolm for this. So just looking at the, just following on this specific point, I'm looking at the ARIS evidence here, which talks about important ministers' thinking is as transparent and well documented as that of councils, as this avoids perceptions of political prejudice, talking specifically about Collins. Notwithstanding what's been said about trying to provide the upfront support to ensure that the process operates as transparently and smoothly as possible, is there not a risk that there is no downside to a minister calling a case in because they don't then simply have to adjudicate it, and that if we have an independent panel with the expertise to adjudicate, are they not in a position to determine whether or not there is a prima facie case to call in that case, once all the various sifts that I think we all agree are a sensible way of progressing have been completed?
I think that's an interesting point, because looking at government's response to the consultation, it said, and it's in paragraph 38, cases which have been called in, which would be expected to be the most difficult cases, will continue to require to be called in. And then at paragraph 44, the review body would look at cases once called in by ministers. So your point is important. There must be, just as there must be clarity about what the review body is there to do, there must be clarity about the decision-making process which ministers follow in calling in proposals in the first place. Otherwise, there is the risk of dispute and even legal action if that is not sufficiently clear. There is an argument, I suppose, that the review body could consider the whole call-in process, but that's probably going down a route that's unhelpful. But there are two stages to this, and all that I think councils would ask of the process is that it's absolutely clear what the criteria are for these decisions, firstly to call in, and then what the review body would be doing.
Thank you very much. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask some questions around the proposal of the expansion of the role in Education Scotland in the process. And given that Education Scotland already has a statutory duty to advise ministers, why do you think a specific duty to advise on school closures is required?
So I'd mentioned this a couple of times. So, by nature, the process of evaluating the merits of a case, and in particular the education benefits of a case, is largely subjective. I think someone recently, when they were talking to me, said it's not like measuring the length of a piece of wood. So you are looking at people with the appropriate credentials and the right professional knowledge and background to make that assessment and judgment. Unfortunately, in the emotion of a proposal being consulted on, our communities quite often spend literally thousands of hours trying to gather evidence to present about why they believe a proposal doesn't demonstrate education benefit. And education professionals from the authority side are presenting the case that they believe it does. And ultimately, neither side is going to batter each other down by weight of opinion or by weight of rational logic. And ultimately, communities are looking for someone independent to make that assessment on their behalf and to give them confidence that what is being said or being proposed will actually deliver the benefits they expect to be realised, or otherwise to say, unfortunately, this doesn't stack up. Education Scotland appear to be uniquely placed to provide that role, but it still comes with a series of caveats that the staff in Education Scotland who have been involved in that process will still be applying their subjective and professional opinion. It will still be subject to challenge. It cannot in itself, the opinions of Education Scotland cannot in themselves be the subject of further appeal. Otherwise, we're going to have appeal on appeal on appeal. So I am actually quite encouraged by hearing last Monday a colleague from Education Scotland talking about their early thoughts in terms of how they would deliver that role. They have capacity issues, there may be a cost implication around it, but I think they're uniquely placed to provide that independent individual assessment that will give reassurance to communities, that will feed back to local authorities, and will also provide some guidance to ministers in considering the merits of a case.
As long as there's the sharp focus on educational benefit that there is at the moment, and in mentioning that, I'm not sure whether I'm preempting a subsequent question. Apparently not.
I mean, it's not for me to say what members might or might not ask, but I mean, if you want to answer the question in a specific way, go ahead, Leslie.
When there's the sharp focus on educational benefit, which most professional educators would indicate carries a level of subjectivity, it's going to be vitally important that Education Scotland plays a role in this process. The formerly known as the Inspectorate, these professionals are held in high regard across the educational community of Scotland. I believe they're held in high regard by parents as well. And there shall be a critical role in evaluating this matter of educational benefit, by which we're talking about one school being better or poorer than another. Their role, however, doesn't come without some problems. Members of the committee may be aware that, as you know, in the post-CRERA reduced scrutiny times, the evaluation by inspectors and the reports issued for schools are less detailed than formerly, and it becomes quite difficult to compare one school against another just from the inspection reports, because we are talking about quite broad bands of quality that are described. So one of the potential problems is that you still don't have an instrument in deploying Education Scotland expertise. You still don't have an instrument that can objectively compare one school's quality with another's as accurately as the Act seems to demand. And if their role is also to support the production of a council's educational benefits statement, then arguably you've got another instance of a body being asked to help produce a policy statement, or at least an evaluation statement, and then subsequently advise ministers on its merit. So the role of Education Scotland would have to be, I think it's inevitable, I think it would be welcomed, but it has to be treated carefully, and in fact there would have to be some form of creating Chinese walls within Education Scotland so that those individuals or parts of the institution who are engaged in support roles are not those who are subsequently advising ministers on the merits of a case.
Thank you. Malcolm?
Yes, I think I would echo that. I think there are necessarily procedural safeguards which will have to be put in place, just probably to protect Education Scotland's independence in their multiple roles here. And the question which Ms Adamson asked was a subtle one. It was, is Education Scotland's assistance required? And I don't think it is required. I think it is probably helpful. And of course, ministers need to be confident in their decisions as well as everyone else, and they will need advice. I'm not qualified to say whether that's best taken from their civil servants or from Education Scotland, but they will need advice if a community or objector says that this council has gone wrong educationally. Ministers will need help in evaluating the arguments that are made. So I think, as Mr Manson says, that their presence is inevitable and probably welcome, but there must be some safeguards procedurally about their involvement.
Sorry, Sandy, I was going to Eileen first.
I think that parents do have a very positive view of the role of Education Scotland, with the kind of health warning that we're also a bit concerned about the slightly cut and paste nature of reports now. But, you know, we have said in our submission, you know, they are not independent, you know, and although, you know, we like to talk about them as independent, they're not. And I think we have to be absolutely clear, and there has to be some clear dividing lines as to roles and functions. How that's organised, I don't know, and Chinese walls certainly, you know. And you know, the inspectorate, as well as Education Scotland now, you know, almost everywhere you go within Scottish education, the network is wide. You know, the network of current and former Education Scotland folk, you know, it's wide. So, you know, I just have a wee bit of a reservation that folk don't assume independence, which isn't there.
Yeah. Parents that we communicate with generally have a great respect for Education Scotland, and they recognise their school in most of the inspection reports that are published by Education Scotland. But we would say that probably Education Scotland haven't lived up to expectations in what was expected of them in the 2010 Act. Now, the exact reasons for that, I'm not sure. There is a cut and paste element to the individual school reports that are produced under the Act. But also there seems to be a reluctance to engage after the fact, after they've done the report. Proposals generally tend to develop throughout a consultation process, and the ones that actually end up being voted on are not necessarily exactly the same as the proposals that Education Scotland inspected the schools at the time on. And there seems to be a reluctance in them to come back into the process. And I think the Act, giving them a role at that end of the process would be helpful.
Yes, can I ask, it's really a question directed to Mr Snedden, because in your submission you said that you say it's critical that the Commission's recommendation 20 is accepted, but the Scottish Government have rejected that proposal and have said that if implemented, this recommendation 20 would weaken the central principle of the 2010 Act, that a local authority must be able to demonstrate educational benefits to children affected by a school closure. Why did you think it was so critical that that recommendation 20 was?
This is probably the question that Mr Manson was alluding to, and it is setting aside the argument that COSLA will put forward, which was that there was a perceived joint agreement to enter into the Commission and abide by the findings of the Commission. Setting that point aside, this is a particularly core and critical element, and it goes back to what are the reasons for education benefit. I saw within the papers an argument put forward that to consider the impact on all of the children in an authority's area in terms of how an authority uses its resources would be an argument that would be put forward to justify removing resources from rural communities generally, and unfortunately I don't hold with that at all. I very recently, to give a case example around this, I had a meeting with a parent council of a secondary school who were concerned about the level of teaching resources available to that school and the impact on its subject choices. The question that was put to me was, why is this authority unable to provide us the level of staffing resources in our school that we would expect when other authorities can? And the straightforward answer from me to them was, for an equivalent population, an urban authority reasonably close to me runs 20 primary schools. I run 78. I run schools with 3 children in it, 4 children, 6 children and 8 children. It's extremely difficult for just as was said by a couple of contributors, to compare directly schools, particularly when people are looking at Education Scotland reports that might be 5 or 6 years old, that the quality of the relationship and the quality of the teaching staff is the single biggest determinant on the quality of education the child has. But when you've got 1 and 2 teacher schools, 1 member of staff leaving the school or moving to another area can be a significant change in terms of that quality of education. To magnify small-scale education benefits falsely, as the existing legislation has often prompted authorities to do, is not helpful. It's divisive. It means that communities and authorities are more often in confrontation, and there needs to be a much more holistic view of how we use our resources to benefit all children. And in an authority area like mine, I've got very few schools that are not rural, so it isn't a case of robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Just a quick final question to the panel. Given the proposals for the expanded role of Education Scotland, what interaction, if any, do you foresee Education Scotland might have with the school closure review body?
Any, just other than simply providing documentation, or because that any review body has to operate independently, so there would be no advisory role. It would simply be one of providing required documents and evidence.
I think procedurally that's absolutely right. The review body will be looking at, first of all, has the process been correctly followed, and whether there is sufficient evidence to show that the merits of the case are made out, in the sense that questions have been answered, considerations are relevant, etc. I can't imagine that the review body would need further specialist advice on educational matters.
Just on that, if the Education Scotland are preparing the statement and then would be advising the review body, surely that would be a conflict of interest.
Potentially, yes. I think that's what we covered in one of the earlier answers. There must some thought must be given to the procedures to protect Education Scotland and everyone else in this.
Yeah, we'll cover that. Liam?
Just briefly on the Education Scotland point, I was interested by the comment Sandy made about an unwillingness of Education Scotland to maybe come back in later in the process, and thinking back to Leslie's earlier comment about the status quo must always be an option within what a council is considering, and including a status quo plus option. Is it your view that in order to deliver a status quo plus option, Education Scotland's support and advice in that is going to be pretty critical, is it not?
I think the status quo probably refers more to, in my view, the likelihood of the status quo being retained is more to do with the place of a school in its wider community. It's the community asset, the way in which it brings people together by virtue of the activities that take place there, and by virtue of the accommodation that's to be found there. I think it's those community arguments that are most likely to prevail
in retaining the status quo rather than the notion that you know, every other potential receiving school is a poor school. It's not my experience that you know, a single authority has a huge variation across its schools. As Graham Donaldson loves to say, the variation in educational provision is greater within schools than across schools. And the one caveat to that is to reiterate the point that Cleland made, and that is that in very, very small schools, which predominantly rural schools are, the quality of the teaching workforce is the single key determinant of that quality. When you're talking about 2 or 3 teachers, each teacher is going to be seeing you know, young children for 2, if not 3 years. And if you've got a poor teacher, and believe me, there are some poor teachers, if that's your teacher for 2 or 3 years, that's a poor quality, and probably any of the receiving neighbouring schools will be an improvement. But I mean, I can't stress enough how significant the consideration of recommendation 20 is for educational professionals. Because if you take 5 parents from the same school catchment area and ask them what they value about their school, you're going to get 5 different answers. The one's going to say the attainment in English and maths. The next one's going to say the expertise of the school sports teams and the concert at Christmas. Somebody else is going to talk about class sizes. Someone else talk about the way in which their child with additional support needs is wonderfully integrated into that school. You're going to get so many different descriptions of quality that it's going to be virtually impossible to form an objective comparison of the quality in that school with the neighbouring schools.
Actually, I should have declared an interest as a parent of was 2 children, now 1 child at a school that was under threat of closure. So for the avoidance of doubt, I put that on the record and certainly echo Leslie's comments about the importance of the quality of the teaching and the wider community function. But perhaps in relation to recommendation 20, is there any way in your view that financial considerations can be separated from the process of arriving at a decision on educational benefit?
Thank you, Chairman. I think the Commission, of which I was a member, debated this long and hard. It was one of our more difficult decisions. And I think on the financial point, we took into account that councils have to balance and are elected politically to make difficult decisions about allocation of resources. And schools legitimately form part of that consideration. But the Commission was very clear that the primary reason for looking at school closures must be about educational quality, not benefits, but quality. And that should be the primary factor. And I think that is more than just a subtlety. As has been eloquently said, demonstrating educational benefits can be very, very hard. In my own area, like Orkney, pupils are usually transferring from a good or very good school to another good or very good school in inspection terms, and one is looking at things like peer group interaction, just numbers, supported learning among pupils simply because numbers are so small. Now, is that a better educational environment? I'm certainly not qualified to say, but it is a better educational social environment, and it is I think an authority should have to show that it has considered primarily these factors. But finance, to come back to your point, finance has to be a factor in today's climate. But it should not be the primary factor.
I think finance has always been considered, regardless of what anybody says. Every proposal I've been involved in, there's well over 100, and I can't think of one where finance wasn't critical to the proposal paper. To say that it's not involved and never have been or won't be in the future is simply wrong. What I would say on the terms of educational benefit is that we are at a time when Scotland, I think the figures are right, Scotland and the UK generally are falling further and further behind, or at least not keeping up with other countries in Europe and Asia in terms of how we develop education. In 2000, we brought forward the School Standards Act, which placed an onus on Scottish ministers and local authorities that any action they took should be to improve education. Now, while I take on board the points, absolutely that in terms of some schools, some proposals, the cases may be a marginal, you know, whether it's a development of education or whether it's a very similar education. In a lot of cases, that may be the case. In other cases, we've seen proposals where the financial savings are predominantly from paying off teachers. 70% of a primary school is teacher staff. If you add in additional transport costs, the loss of revenue grant, and so on, the savings, the financial savings, come generally from the removal of staff, predominantly teachers. Now, are we saying that the removal of teachers is an educational benefit? Then, if that's the case, then surely losing even more teachers is a greater educational benefit. Educational benefit should, and it's always been part of the consideration, and in the School Standards Act, I think you would have to repeal it in order to bring this change through.
Thank you very much. Joan McAlpine.
Yes, thank you. My question kind of follows on from Sandy's point, actually. It's with regard to financial information on schools closure. I know that a lot of stakeholders supported the proposal to amend the 2010 Act to make it clear that relevant financial information should be included in a school closure consultation, but some submissions from local authorities have suggested that they shouldn't have to submit all the financial details because some of them could be, for example, commercially confidential. I wondered whether you could give us your view about perceived difficulties in ensuring consistent treatment of financial information across different local authorities and how that might be resolved.
Caroline.
For committee's purposes, maybe I can give a quick illustration. There's a short answer to this, which is a piece of work has been undertaken between Scottish Government, COSLA and ADIS to produce a standard financial template and guidance. I can't think of a circumstance where you wouldn't want to present full and accurate information. If there's commercial confidentiality, it can still be included. It just needs to be grouped up in such a way that you're not breaching our confidence. But that piece of work, I think, is well advanced. I think once it's concluded, it will remove any arguments because there will be a consistency in terms of every authority presenting its financial information the same way. There's a potential argument as well to say that to avoid further disputes around other areas, that a standardised template for proposal documents in the wider sense could also assist.
Chairman, I think the way forward is a template that authorities can and everyone can agree reflects as well as possible and as consistently as possible the financial information. I can't envisage circumstances in which commercial contracts could really override the provision of information to parents and communities on the true cost of a school. But it is a complicated area. I wouldn't take the committee's time, and it is different for each authority because my own authority is a beneficiary from the floor mechanism. That affects that has an effect if we were to lose GAE, granted expenditure for a rural school. It affects my council differently from a council which is not a beneficiary from the floor, and that too has to be factored in. So there will always be comments on the template, but the way forward, I think, is an agreed and consistent mechanism, and there's a means for doing that.
We haven't seen the template. From the comments that we've seen about it, it does seem to have been a good attempt at getting something which we would agree to. But like I said, we haven't seen it. Some of the comments which were made in response to people who have seen the template. One of the comments in response to the consultation was that things like redundancy costs should not be included because they come from a central pool. I mean, that typifies the kind of mindset that we come against all the time. That's the same authority which said that the receiving school would require 2 extra teachers, but they wouldn't cost anything because they came from a central pool. You know, the fact that they had 3 teachers, and therefore that was not a cost of the closure. I mean, that's the kind of thing you come up against all the time. And like I said, we need some kind of standardisation, some kind of standard template which removes that kind of nonsense from the process.
Agree.
Yeah, so I take it from what you're saying, Sandy, that a lot of the financial information in the past has been inadequate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's been the biggest single failing that we've come across is the financial argument that's been made. I mean, it's been interesting that the local authorities have been saying in the last few weeks that they've had to, I'm not sure you use the word properly, but whether it's embellish the educational argument because the onus is on them to show an educational benefit that they can't really show. So therefore, they've had to go further, and this has brought in an area of contention. When we've seen the financial argument, there's also an element of that they have to show a saving. So therefore, sometimes it's a lack of care. Sometimes you can see where there are basic mistakes have been made. I mean, there was one case, Roy Bridge in Highland, where a column of figures had not been added up correctly, and it took us 6 months to get them to agree that the figures didn't add up. I mean, any kid, 9-year-old kid with a pocket calculator could add it up and see that it was wrong, but the council simply would not admit it. Yes, I mean, it is an area where we see the more errors than anywhere else.
Okay, brief supplementary from Liam.
Following that point up, I mean, Cullen, you've talked about COSLA, ADIS and Scottish Government agreeing the template. I assume that the network will be invited to comment before the template is concluded and agreed. Is that a fair assumption?
I'm not part of that piece of work. I would assume that appropriate stakeholders, and that may include the network, but that it will be subject to wider consultation. I know that a piece of work was done with a kind of limited circulation. Some comments come in from various authorities. Once that's in place, it's in all of our interest to have the most robust template. As I'd mentioned earlier, it might be a good blueprint to actually have a wider template that includes the full presentation of information, not just financial, and it might help us in that way.
From that, Leslie, given you're representing ADIS here today.
Yes, I like Cleland, I don't know what COSLA's intentions are with this, but I mean, I've seen the famous template. It's starting to assume some sort of spy proportions here, but it's just a series of headings which would require each council to separate out the known costs of any proposal and set them out in a matrix so that people would be familiar with the context. They would see that there's comparability from one school to another, one authority to another. It's just to regularise it, because believe me, I mean, I have a background in maths. I can count, but some of the Byzantine calculations or grant-aided expenditure, and in particular how they relate to the provision of rural schools. I think there's probably only 2 people on the planet who understand those, and one of them's sitting over on my right there. So I don't believe, from discussions I've had across ADES, that education authorities acted any other than in good faith. And I think the whole process has led to a wider and deeper understanding. Not complete by any means. We've still got some way to go to understand GAE. But I think there's a wider and deeper understanding, and I think no one would want to try and fox the public, to try to mislead the public in something as objective as numbers. But all councils present their accounts in different ways, and it's not always clear to the educationists who are leading these sorts of proposals. We don't always understand and get the information from our finance. They don't often know that there's a problem to give us the solution to. So I think only good will come out of the standardisation, and I believe that there'll be more transparency and better understanding in future.
Colin Beattie.
One area where there doesn't seem to be unanimity is the question of this 5-year moratorium. In other words, a council wouldn't be able to revisit for a period of 5 years any decision on a closure. I'd be interested in the panel's comments on that.
Can I kick off? I have the pleasure of living and working in the community where I was born, and I have direct experience of closing schools, of amalgamating schools. I know what it feels like. I've done it over a number of years. And even before the moratorium, I was engaged in some similar proposals, one of which touched Liam MacArthur's personal circumstances. And I can assure you that the angst, the fear, the upset caused to communities by this proposal is well known to me, and I dare say most of my professional colleagues. It's not something that we would wish to visit lightly on any community or any parent group, or for that matter any school. It's very much a matter of last resort. It destabilises a community. Ironically, it also brings a community together. So if you've got a disparate community and you want to bring them together, threaten their school, and they'll gel very, very quickly. But you can't impose on your neighbours, your community members, this constant merry-go-round of closure proposals. It's just inhumane. Nevertheless, 5 years is a long time, and I do understand that the intention here was to ensure that no single council made the same proposal about the same school during its lifetime. It was to separate out, it had to be a fresh council that would reconsider any proposal for a specific school. But in a very, very small school, 5 years is a long time. I mean, things can change very, very quickly. You can be talking about a school where there are 3 children from 2 families, 1 family with 2 children leave. You may have a completely unsustainable situation which is in no one's best interests. You may have a very determined family left in that area that insist on keeping that school open for that 1 child, despite the fact that there's a much, much better educational experience just 3-5 miles down the road. To saddle a child, a family, an education authority with that as an untouchable scenario for...
I'm slightly puzzled by your answer, or the later parts of your answer. It's quite clear that it says that there will be, under exceptional circumstances, possibility to review the position earlier than 5 years. So if there's an opportunity to deal with it under exceptional circumstances, which you seem to be suggesting, then I don't see the problem that you're painting.
Perhaps one of my colleagues in that case.
Sandy?
Yeah, I would agree absolutely entirely. The provision is to allow such exceptional circumstances. We've seen schools threatened repeatedly. Some schools threatened 3 or 4 times within a 10-year period. And Leslie's absolutely right. It is inhumane. It is destabilising. You eventually get to a point where people give up. Yeah, and people who are totally passionate about their community in the school, you can see them just becoming battle-weary. Again, you do not want to be overly prescriptive. You do not want to say that in a situation where everybody leaves the school, you must keep it open. And think of one example. Cabrach was repeatedly threatened with closure. But at the end of the day, there was a radon gas issue. The roll dropped to a remarkably low level. And we would not have stood in the way of that council in actually closing that school. I mean, we would have considered that to have been exceptional circumstances. But I think schools need to be left with that degree of stability, with some kind of assurance, just simply out of experience that we've seen of schools that have been repeatedly threatened. I can think of one in Varan in Murray, which continually feels, the whole community feels that it has had a 5-year moratorium and it's just ended. And they're continually feeling that they're next, they're always first in line. And a number of parents, it's a fantastic school, HMI report after HMI report is exceptional. And yet there are a number of parents within that catchment area that won't send their children to that school, regardless how exceptional it is. They just simply refuse to send their children there because the perception is that it will always close at the next possible opportunity.
I think I would just add that that threat, actually, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for exactly that reason, that parents say, well, I'm not going to send my child there because it's going to close in 3 or 4 or 5 years and it'll be disrupted, so I'll just make that decision now. And so you don't just lose one child, you lose a family to that school. And so you end up with no kids at the school. So I think a 5-year moratorium is a sound plan.
I would feel it is simply too long. And I mean, our own council submission recommended 3, because there can be substantial changes to a school role in that period. And again, a competent council would look not just at that point in time, but at the 0 to 5 population. And I know a case in my own area where a school was left with 4 pupils, all of whom were placing requests. And there was no one from the local area, from the catchment area, and no one coming up. Now, there's a question as to whether that's truly a local school. And I think a 5-year moratorium is just a little too long, given the financial circumstances in which we are, and given the radical changes that can happen with roles in very small schools. But I appreciate there is some provision for exceptional circumstances.
Colin, do you have any final supplementary, if you don't mind?
Yeah, there seems to be, we've talked about significant changes. Would changes in financial circumstances be valid? Some say yes, some say no. And if so, for example, would a reduction in public sector funding be considered a significant reason to revisit?
Yes. If local authorities in Scotland experience the reductions in grant that our colleagues down south have experienced with very little run-in time, it will be inevitable that the entire budget of local government comes under scrutiny. To take approximately half of the expenditure of a local authority and tie a bow around it and say that cannot be touched disproportionately impacts on the care for our elderly people, our children and family services, our roads infrastructure, etc., etc. And simply is an unacceptable level of disproportionate pressure on part of the Council's budget. I think we need to be clear about what we mean about these exceptional circumstances. If it's left as broad and woolly as in exceptional circumstances, it will give rise to potential manipulation of those words, challenge against those words, etc. We should be actually quite clear about what those exceptional circumstances are, so that we don't get into some broad argument about whether they apply or not. Just one very quick point to add to the comments around the exceptional circumstances that would be in place. Our communities cannot be exposed to being battered down by repetitive consultations to such an extent that they're always ready and ripe for a school closure. But equally, we have to recognise that most of these schools are in a position where they're being considered for a school merger or school closure, whatever you want to term it, because of the role projections and because of their current role. And the presence of a school isn't necessarily enough to prevent that community's kind of changes in terms of its make-up, its decline, etc. Equally, we've got many communities that don't have a school in it that are thriving and expanding. So we need a much broader understanding of what makes a community and where a school sits within that as one of a number of community assets. But we need, just going back to it, we need the clarity around what those exceptional circumstances are.
Okay, I'm going to have to move on, Sandy, unless it's extremely brief.
It's just, what are we talking about? We sound like what this financial aspect that the question was asked about is like it's the make or break for Scotland's financial future. We've already agreed that schools which will go to call-in or will be a very, very small number. We're talking about 1, 2, 3 schools a year, or even less than that could be reprieved from closure and come forward again. I mean, we are not talking, in terms of council finances, we're not talking a make or break situation here.
Thank you very much. There's a number of questions and I'm going to try and squeeze them in 2 minutes, but very briefly, Liam.
I'm conscious that in Orkney, for example, as Liz will know, we have a situation where a secondary department has been mothballed and another school on another island has been mothballed. And I'm just wondering whether the panel are satisfied that the rules around mothballing and where you would mothball as opposed to move to closure are satisfactorily understood, not least in terms of what it would take to trigger a demothballing. Whether this would almost seem as a kind of soft option to closure.
Briefly, we do, as Liam says, have 2 schools which are currently mothballed, and while parents would much rather have a school open, they prefer mothballing to the school being definitively closed. It's relatively easy for the authority to reopen the school if the pupil numbers demand it. but also for the community. I think it offers hope that if pupils move in, the school's there for the future.
Is that a genuine view? I mean, it seems, slightly odd. I can take Liam's point here. Is that effectively an option that councils could use to get round the purpose of the legislation?
Say that could be done cynically, but our council has articulated the conditions under which that school would reopen. And it's done so in numerical terms. It's a kind of logistical combination of a number of pupils coming from a number of families where they think it will be viable and preferable to reopen the school. So you've got an objective benchmark which the community is aware of and professes itself happy with.
It has happened. Altnahara in Highland reopened after a period of mothballing. And it was due to the economic development. I think a logging plant was opened in the area, and the nearest school, I think about 27 miles away or something, and they reopened the school, which had been mothballed. I think one of the island schools in Shetland has also been mothballed and reopened when people moved to the island. It is an option, and it's an option that should be there. It is, some people would perceive, again, it depends who does it. There is a perception that it may be being used in some cases to get around the Act, but we're reassured by people like Leslie, who are doing it in an open and honest way.
I have a
Even
school
less than that, if you can manage.
Yeah, okay. A school that was mothballed for 2 years because it had no pupils in it. 4 parents, or two sets of parents, approached me and wanted to enrol 4 children. It would have met the criteria where I was having some very serious discussions about the benefits for their children of reopening the school, but they were adamant they were going to do so, and we eventually reopened it. I have another school with 4 pupils in it now. I don't think it's a way around the Act. It's actually a reality, and it was partly through the moratorium, and that's the impact that it has on me.
Thank you. Final question from Neil.
Yeah, just like to ask you, for each of your organisations, are there likely to be any cost implications associated with the Scottish Government's proposed amendments?
I'm just going to run along the panel. Cleland?
Nothing obvious. No.
Leslie?
At the moment.
No, nothing immediately obvious.
So that was painless. So can I thank you all very much for coming along. This is obviously a very important part of what will become the Children and Young People Act eventually. And we're very keen to hear your views. So thank you very much both for the written submissions we've received and also for your time today. Thank you. Can I suspend briefly? Can I welcome Michael Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, to the committee meeting this morning. Can I also welcome Scottish Government officials, Claire Morley and Lorraine Stirling. Welcome to all of you. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some opening remarks before we move to questions?
Thank you very much, Convener. Let me start with I think what is obvious, that closing any school is a difficult decision, and communities deserve and indeed demand clarity on how the process will operate and have a voice in decision-making. The whole purpose of the legislation, both the original legislation and these amendments, was to create that level playing field, so that both sides felt, even if they didn't agree, that they had been fairly treated. This is, of course, the second time in recent years that we've looked at the legislation in detail on this issue. The Schools Consultation Scotland Act 2010 was unanimously passed by the Parliament. It updated and strengthened consultation procedures for school closures and other significant proposals affecting schools, and it was preceded by a proposed private member's bill from Murdo Fraser. However, there were early concerns about how it operated in rural areas, and the Commission on the Delivery of Rural Education was set up in 2011, jointly between the Scottish Government and COSLA, to address these issues. The Commission reported in April 2013, and the Government has accepted 37 of the Commission's 38 recommendations. We intend to bring forward amendments at Stage 2 to implement recommendations from the Commission on the Delivery of Rural Education. These amendments, in my view, will improve the consultation and determination process for school closures. Whilst the Commission concentrated on rural education, the majority of amendments will apply to the process for all school closure proposals. I am committed to continuous improvement in education in Scotland, and I'm sure that that is the position of the committee too. I believe that a school estate which fits the needs of communities in the 21st century has a key part to play in this. But a school closure has a significant disruptive effect on pupils and communities, and therefore I could not support proposals that go ahead without an expectation that this difficult process would lead to educational benefit. And it's also very important to recognise that other factors are in play. For example, the impact of a school closure on a rural community. Over the summer, the Government consulted, as you know, on making amendments to the Act in 6 policy areas: the presumption against closure of a rural school, providing financial information on closure proposals, clarifying and expanding Education Scotland's role, the basis for determining school closure proposals, establishing an independent referral mechanism, and a 5-year moratorium between closure proposals for the same school. The consultation had 226 responses. Respondents supported most aspects of the Government proposals. Our response to the consultation, published on the 18th of November, which was supplied to you, Convener, and to members of the committee, I think, confirmed we plan to take them all forward. I'm happy to talk about how we intend to do so. I should stress that the amendments will be tabled in plenty of time for the Stage 2 committee, but of course I am open to discussion and suggestion and improvement of amendments. I always believe that that's a useful part of the parliamentary process.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I just want to go straight to questions, if you don't mind. I'm going to begin with Liz Smith.
Morning, Cabinet Secretary. We've obviously had a difference of opinion, both in the written submissions that we received and again this morning, about the use of the term presumption. And I think we were all agreed at 2010 that it wasn't necessary to put it into the legislation, but we've come across a situation where perhaps we got that wrong. Would you be able to put on record exactly why you believe that the clarity around that would improve the whole setup?
Yes, well, I think that there are two parts to that, if I might say. One was the opinion of the courts, because we are here today for a variety of reasons, one of which is a court action brought by Colleen Neil and Shiar regarding closures in their area. And one of the issues arisen out of that is the belief of the courts, and testing of legislation in courts is a normal enough process. It's not frequent, but it does happen. The belief of the courts that the presumption is not present in the legislation. Now, all of us who voted on that legislation believed it was in that legislation. It's not an issue that was significantly dealt with during the debate on the bill because it was believed it was in there. It's not in there, and therefore we have to make it clearer if that is the bill's legislative intent, or was the legislative intention of Parliament. So, first of all, I think we need to do it because the view of the courts isn't there. But the second one is the way in which it is done, and the idea behind it is quite clear, that what should happen is that local authorities should say to themselves, when coming to consider the issue of a closure of a rural school, that there are, and they are defined, there are special issues to be considered here. Have they been properly considered before the school process kicks in, before the closure process kicks in? And I think that we need to be clear about what those special issues are. I'm entirely open to improve that. I think we will bring forward our ideas of how that should happen. But if the committee and others have other ideas about how to improve it, let us debate them.
The difference of opinion is that, on one hand, raising the bar will ensure that there is greater confidence in the system, and it will make people much more accurate in the information that they provide. That's one opinion. The other opinion, which again was put to us this morning, is that it's only possibly useful to have the presumption within the legislation. In other words, it's not going to give any added value, or it's going to be very difficult to distinguish what that added value is. So as a committee, we've got sort of two very different opinions. Is it correct that the Scottish Government believes that by putting it in the Act with that clarity, that we will actually be able to be sure and certain of more information that is directly relevant to any situation of potential closure?
That may be an outcome. I'm not sure it's the intention. I mean, I'm long enough in the tooth to have marched for the right of having a presumption against rural school closures. This didn't come from the Scottish debate. It came originally from the English debate, and it came in the 1990s during debates in England upon school closures. When there was an early round of school closures in Argyll, and some of those I was involved, though not a member for Argyll at that stage, but as a member of this committee, I think in 1999-2000, then one of the issues at that stage was finding a way in which a presumption against closure, in inverted commas, was available in Scotland to prevent the closure of schools in the special circumstances. Now, I think stating that we wanted to achieve that in legislation, in this legislation, was one thing. How you achieve it is the second thing. Now, what we thought we were doing was to make sure that local authorities must consider, and I use the words must consider, viable alternative to closure, the likely community impact, the likely impact of changes in travelling arrangements. These were seen as particularly important in rural school closures. And this is the bit of the change that applies only to rural schools. It doesn't look as if, from the opinion of the courts, that that is yet firmly enough within the bill, and therefore we're putting in place. So that will be the effect of, well, that will be what will be there. The effect of it may also be what you're talking about in terms of improved information, although that is dealt with in further amendments, particularly on financial information and on the issue of templates for financial information, where there has been, I think, a need to standardise that information. So I'm probably teasing out, if you allow me, two different things. One is those special circumstances, the things that need to be considered really before the process kicks in. What are the alternatives? What is the likely community impact? What is the likely impact on travelling? And then perhaps later down the road, that presumption, if a closure is to go ahead, and presumably at some stages, having considered the closure doesn't go ahead, or the proposal, at some stage, an improvement in that information, particularly on those issues.
The fact that you've obviously changed your mind, as we have too, since 2010, when we didn't want that word in the Act, and now the implication is that we do. Is that based on the fact that there has been too much misinterpretation of the existing legislation?
I'm not sure. I wasn't the minister who took this bill through, so I'm not entirely sure at that stage. I don't think minds have been changed. I think what was intended has not been achieved, and therefore we want to, presumably if the Parliament agrees that we want to have this in, then we have to do so. I am open to the issue of the words themselves. I think there were legal reasons why that seemed undesirable last time. I've asked that that be continued to be considered. It is quite difficult because the interpretation of the words presumption against closure might be even more difficult. But I am open to that. And indeed, when we publish our amendment, if they're not in there, I'm quite willing to say at that stage why they are not in there.
Thank you very much.
Just clarify, it was raised this morning, Cabinet Secretary, that including a presumption against closure would raise an unrealistic expectation amongst members of the public. What's your view on that?
I don't think that's true. I think the presumption against closure says the existence of rural schools is something important and special. That's what it says. And because of what they provide educationally and of what they provide to the community, they are important and special. And before a decision is taken to close a rural school, there should be a moment at which people say, stop. This is important and special. Are we to proceed? Now, this helps local authorities decide that, but nothing in this legislation says that schools do not close. And I have never, ever said, as somebody who's been deeply involved in this issue for a long time, that every school is sacrosanct. I believe that schools close themselves. I believe that you get to a stage where a school is the community is too small. There have been occasions where communities have said the closure of this school here that serves us is a necessary step for us to get better educational services. That has happened. I can think of a couple of occasions. That's great. What shouldn't happen is that we shouldn't subscribe to the fallacy that closing schools automatically leads to educational progress, which seems to me axiomatic, though some people actually seem to believe it. And secondly, we should be enormously sceptical about some of the figures that have been bandied around during school closures processes, because they almost invariably turn out not to be true.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. Just following up that theme, and Cabinet Secretary has been fairly candid in terms of the thinking that's going on within government around putting the presumption word into legislation. I think what we heard this morning was that while that presumption is one held by the Parliament, as clearly stated during the previous debate, it's expressed through the achievement of particular criteria in the process. And therefore, I think what was being said to us by some on the earlier panel was that looking again at those criteria and making sure that they give effect to that presumption may be a better way of achieving that presumption than sticking the word presumption in the legislation.
I think that's distinctly possible, and I don't want to rule either of those approaches out, or even a hybrid approach. The drafting is not finished at that stage, and equally I'll make the point that were we to come with a draft which the committee would wish to see improved, then I'd be open, as I'm always open between stage 2 and stage 3, to discuss that further. I think what the government's intention would be is to be true to what the Parliament's intention was unanimously, where this was to say there should be, expressed in legislation in some way, this presumption against closure, which effectively means that there is a special and important nature of rural schools that require to be considered in a special way.
For absolute clarity, I mean, what is the difference? What's the fundamental difference between having special regard to certain factors and having a presumption against closure?
I think I would call the presumption a stronger measure, and it would be a measure that underlies policy. I think that's what I'd define it. But I'm happy, Convener, to have that conversation with you. But my reaction immediately was to say it is a stronger thing, and it expresses a policy intent. We regard, and I hope Scotland regards, rural education, provision of rural education as important, not just for educational reasons, so that's good enough, but it's also important in terms of the way in which we sustain and support rural communities, often fragile rural communities.
Okay, thank you. Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. The Court of Session found that the 2010 Act currently requires Scottish ministers to consider the merits of a school closure proposal as well as the process undertaken. And then all those responding to the consultation on amendments supported the consideration of merits by Scottish ministers. So I'm wondering what level of merit consideration you think it would be appropriate for ministers to pursue.
I think that this has been and thank you for the question, this is a very interesting and important part of the change. As the Act was negotiated and discussed with various stakeholders, the original Act, I think there was a very strong view that this should not second-guess local authorities in the decision-making process. Local authorities, I hesitate to suggest, would have been anything but happy and would not have agreed to that. So the idea was that this shouldn't be second-guessed. What the courts have said is something that goes somewhat further than I think anybody had anticipated it might have gone. I understand the concept of merit to be one in which expresses what one would expect a reasonable decision to be, reasonable decision-making. So a reasonable decision based upon the evidence in front of you would seem to be the limit of the merit argument. In other words, in addition to observing the process that has taken place, there should be some judgment as to whether, you know, a reasonable local authority, reasonable people within a local authority would make that decision based upon the evidence that they have. So I think that's where it is extended to. I don't see it extending any further than that, and it is absolutely not the role of government to retake that decision, because that would, you know, in those circumstances, it would be the wrong thing to happen.
So therefore, you're happy with the proposal to remit a closure decision back to the local authority?
I think that remitting a closure decision back to local authority could be an effective tool. It doesn't. It adds to the number of tools that are available. You know, that is closure, no closure. No closure with conditions, you know, no closure with conditions, it adds to that tool and therefore might be a reasonable and useful thing to do. And I think the Commission is right in that regard. I should stress, you know, you've given me an opportunity just to mention this, that I'm grateful to David Sutherland and to the entire Commission. I think we've done a very good job. And I should stress that we have accepted 37 out of 38 recommendations. Now, having served as a member of one of these commissions some years ago, the Arbuthnot Commission, I think that there was probably only one or two of our recommendations that were accepted. So this is a high average. You know, we've accepted virtually everything that the Commission has said.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. Just looking for some information on the proposals for the independent referral mechanism, Cabinet Secretary. Can you tell us who will appoint members of the independent review body, to whom they will be accountable, and how will you ensure political independence?
I think that's an issue which, when the legislation, when the amendments are published, will be much clearer for everybody. We're still working on this idea. There are a number of possibilities, and we want this to be simple. We want it not to be expensive. We want it to be something which is transparent and open. So let's start with the principles. Those are the principles we're applying. I think the choices are, there are broadly speaking 3 choices, and I won't commit myself to any of them just now because I think we still want to be absolutely confident we have the right choice, but then, you know, it is up to you, Mr. Bibby, or anybody else to amend this to have other choices, and we can have a useful discussion about it. But essentially, we could put in place our own tribunal system. We could entirely go for arbitration to the Scottish Arbitration Service, or we might find a hybrid between the two that was cheaper and more effective. In terms of accountability, I would expect the Minister to appoint the key individual, chair or whatever, and to have a process for appointing anybody else who's involved. It should be able to operate entirely independently. It should be able to operate very simply. I don't see it as something in which, you know, there's vast amounts of lawyers or expense. I think that it should be reviewable, but only on a point of law, and that would require a review to the sheriff on a point of law, which is much, much simpler. One of the things I'd like to avoid in this is the rerun that we've had, you know, in the recent court case that left some schools sitting for a very long period of time with insecurity. But I do think it is helpful if at that final stage of the process 2 things happen. One is that it is seen to be impartial and independent and non-political. And secondly, it is approachable, or at least one occasion, by schools or communities who are involved. So wrapping all those up, what I'm wanting to see is that simple, transparent, clear process, doesn't take too long, which is at arm's length from government and gives public confidence. And that will be what is encapsulated in the final amendment when it's tabled.
In terms of, you mentioned cost there, and will the body be paid, and if so, by whom?
I don't know as yet. It's an option that we will exist. You know, the labourer is worthy of his hire. You wouldn't want me not to pay people for the work that they do. If it is paid, it will be paid in exactly the same way as people who sit on any independent body or tribunal. But they will not be accountable through payment to ministers in that regard.
And I'd also like to ask you, what if local authorities wish to appeal the decision made by the independent referral mechanism? Will there be any opportunity for them to appeal?
Indicated, I think we should have a simple, clear process that doesn't run on forever, and therefore the intention would be at present to have appeal on points of law only to the Sheriff Court.
Liam.
Cabinet Secretary, this morning we heard quite a bit of support across the first panel for a kind of phased filtering process, so that actually you front-end the support in terms of advice to councils about issues they may have in any closure programme. And I think we can all understand that at the back end of the process, the independence of a referral mechanism, having an ability to appeal to that, again, I think commanded support. Where I'm not sure necessarily I entirely understood the rationale for ministers having a call-in power to be referred to the independent referral panel, why it would be that you would need that intervention from the minister rather than the referral panel being able to look at the prima facie evidence and suggesting this is one that requires us to take a view on it, not least because I think Addis and their evidence suggested that there was a need for transparent and well-documented the importance of ministers' thinking in terms of calling needs to be transparent and well-documented so as to avoid perceptions of political prejudice. And it just seems that having gone to the trouble of setting up this independent referrals panel, why you would still seek to have a call-in process for ministers who then wouldn't ultimately have the decision to take.
I think there are three parts to this, which, if you'll allow me, I just want to work our way through. The first is that one of the failures of the legislation at the moment, and I think Addis, I'm sure, would have reflected on this, I think local authorities would too, that more proposals have been called in than anybody thought was going to happen. Right? So that's one. Now, why is that? I don't think it's political interference. I know that has been an accusation, but I don't think it's political interference. I think there are a number of reasons. Now, giving Education Scotland a clearer role at that stage, advising both ministers and local authorities, but also building the confidence of communities in their impartiality is the first step. And there are amendments that deal with that, and I think that's broadly agreed that we should do so. So let us assume that that works. If that works, then the number of call-ins falls quite substantially. At the other end of the process, the number of call-ins that then result in a closure decision that can be appealed will be commensurately smaller too. We're talking about, we hope, a very small number in those circumstances. Sitting in the middle is a democratic accountability on the process of the legislation. You know, the legislation is something that the Parliament has passed. The Parliament wants to make sure, through the Scottish Government, the duly elected Scottish Government, that there is a priority given to rural schools, that the school closure process is fair and takes place on a level playing field. So I think that providing there is clear enough guidance on what the reasons for a call-in will be, and we're now back to the process and merit issues, there is a democratic place for the minister. Remember that, or for Scottish ministers collectively, remember that the idea of the tribunal was not in the Commission's report. I felt that in order to inject even further confidence in this process and to remove the accusation of the final decision being made accused of being made politically, we should have that tribunal in place. But I think if you were to take the minister out of that three-part process entirely, then I think you're missing the democratic accountability, and I think that the way in which the balance is struck would be damaged. Now, it is open to you, of course, to amend the bill in that way. I will say that I will, as I always do, Mr. MacArthur, with your suggestions, I will seriously think about it, because I can see where you're coming from. I think there is a place for that accountability, and I think I want to preserve the place for that accountability. But I'm not saying I won't think about the point you've raised, which is one I've heard from one or two individuals.
I mean, I think I appreciate that response. I mean, I think the concern would be that notwithstanding the assistance that's provided earlier in the process, which hopefully will result in fewer cases progressing to the point of requiring to be considered for call-in, that actually there's no disincentive on whoever is in the role of Cabinet Secretary to call in, knowing that the decision is then taken by an independent referral. So in terms of the democratic legitimacy, it would almost... I can't see necessarily how it satisfies that criteria, simply because it becomes a bit of a post-box exercise, which ultimately will inevitably lead to the independent referral panel having to sit and consider.
I mean, if you look at it another way, and it's just perhaps important remembering this, the first decision to close is made by elected politicians. The second decision and call-in on what we're proposing will be made by an elected politician. It is only at the end of that process that we remove the elected politicians from it to make that final choice. I think that's not an illogical way of seeing this as a matter that grows in. And there are legal tests for a call-in decision. You know, one of the issues that Colin Nayland Shear was involved in was to challenge the decision to call in, as well as other decisions. So legal tests to a minister seem appropriate. If it was the independent tribunal, we might not have those legal tests. But I'm willing to consider the point you've raised, certainly. But I think there are arguments for it.
Okay, thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to ask you about the proposals to expand the role of Education Scotland in the process. And given that Education Scotland already has a statutory duty to advise ministers, why do you think a specific duty to advise on school closures is required?
Because I think that there are a whole range of issues that we're dealing with here which build confidence in the legislation and in the process. And I think that the local authorities themselves, COSLA in their discussions with me, wish to see a strengthening and clarification of the Education in Scotland process. I want to see more confidence in all parties, because there are a number of parties to these decisions in the Educational Scotland process. So I think that because we want legislation that is even more transparent, even more appropriate, and the advice is crucial to that, then I want to, in a sense, shine a spotlight on the role of Education Scotland so that they are able to do that to the best of their ability. The number of cases coming through is not enormous. This is not a huge additional burden. I mean, obviously, we will discuss with Education Scotland what resources required, but I think it just puts them in a better position to be fair to everybody if we clarify that within the legislation. And I think local authorities believe, and I think they may be right, that if the time and effort spent by Education Scotland is increased, and there is a clarity, we will have fewer call-ins.
Can I ask about how the objectivity and independence of Education Scotland can be maintained, given that it may have been giving help to develop the case for the school closure, and then be in a position of writing a report on that to you to advise you? And the evidence this morning talked about maybe Chinese walls in Education Scotland to keep those independent. Is that how you envisage the process?
Education Scotland will not be involved in writing individual educational benefit statements. That's not what they do. They will certainly give advice about what a good educational benefit statement is. In other words, how clear it should be, the information required to be in it. But they are judging this not on. They're not a player in each individual education, each local authority's decision, nor should they be. Right. So, if Chinese walls are necessary, they would be there. But I think there are two different roles here, and that's not a role they fulfil.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that answer. The final, you've mentioned about the resource implications. You don't see that as being a significant burden at this stage, which is welcome. Do you envisage that there would be any interaction between Education Scotland and the school closure review body?
Well, I would expect there to be so. I would expect the review body or the assessment body to have access to the Education Scotland information. I think one of the questions of the review body is what additional information it would wish, seek, or could have. By the time you get to that position, you are actually. You've gone through a lot of information. There's a lot of things in this. It's thought through very carefully. Scottish ministers will have had advice from Education Scotland. The local authority will know the education advice. If there are circumstances in which it is appropriate that they continue to do so, I see no bar to that. I want the review body to be very transparent, so I think they should say what they're seeking, what information they've had. I don't think anything in that process should be secret, not at that stage.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier trying obviously to keep costs to an absolute minimum in this process, but are there any resource implications for Education Scotland in taking on these additional duties?
Small resource implications for Education Scotland, but I don't think they're significant. I think we were talking about one and a half people, but we will discuss that with them. It's not a significant matter.
Okay, thank you very much. Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, or good afternoon rather. I wanted to ask you about the financial information in school closure proposals, and I know that your amendments are insisting that local authorities give full information when making these kind of decisions. Some local authorities in their response to the consultation were unhappy about that, and if I could quote Eastern Bartonshire Council, they said there are a number of considerations that may not be appropriate to publish in the financial information. These include teachers' pay information and land valuations, which are commercially sensitive, and I wondered if you could just respond to that.
They would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, the reality of the situation is teachers' pay information is available on national pay scales. It's not exactly a secret how much teachers are paid. It is, with it well published. On land valuations, I would expect the local authority would want to be transparent. And, if a public body owns an asset, they must be prepared to say how much that asset is worth. And that's an obvious matter. So I don't believe that is true. I think what we need to get here is, and what the original Act was intended to achieve, was an absolute clarity and a level playing field. And what we need to do in this amendment is to make sure, and again, it was unanimously accepted, so actually, COSLA has accepted this as we have accepted this. What we're trying to do here is to make sure that there is a clear understanding of what the finances are. I'm absolutely certain, knowing he is sitting behind me, that Sandy Longmuir will have told you something about the intricacies of financing rural schools. It's a complex area. It is the sort of educational equivalent of the Schleswig-Holstein question, if you remember correctly. But there are some people who understand it, and it is important that it is set out simply for a community to understand. There has been some, I think I would use the term, spectacular bad practice in this regard. There's also been some unfortunate mistakes. What we need to make sure is that that is clear and simple, and local authorities and communities are agreed upon it. I also believe that an approach to school closure, there is, in a sense, some pot of gold at the end of every school closure rainbow, turns out to be untrue far more often than it turns out to be true. And I think it is very important that we say that to people, that they understand this, and that we publish figures that reflect that reality. Most school closures do not save significant sums of money for local authorities. And when set against the damage they can do in rural communities, particularly the intangible damage they can do, they are, to be honest, simply not worth it. There are occasions where that is necessary. There are occasions where, for example, taking one example in recent times, a building can be so badly damaged and with a problem with the building that it is impossible to envisage that building remaining open. And in those circumstances, the cost of keeping it open would be impossibly high to meet. But in most cases, keeping a rural school open and endeavouring to rebuild a rural community, because they are two sides of the same coin, is the right strategy, particularly in areas where you have a falling population. I represent an area that has one of the highest, has the worst performance in that regard. It is crucial we keep people in rural Scotland. And closing services doesn't keep people in communities. It's just true. So we need to understand all that complexity, and we need to understand the figures that local authorities are working on, the projections they're working on, and make that available, including the effect of GAE.
Thank you very much for that answer. When I asked this question of the previous panel, you're quite right, Mr Longmuir did echo some of the same points as yourself. It was also mentioned that there was a template being put in place to ensure consistency of financial information. Can you give us some information about how that's progressing and what your aspirations are for that?
It's progressing well. It's a good negotiation. When it's through, and it's largely for ourselves and local authorities, I'm sure we'll be happy to make sure it is widely available and the committee can judge it. But actually, it's a positive set of discussions. It is in everybody's interest to sort this out. I mean, in a sense, this legislation has taught lots of people lots of things. It's taught me things. It's taught local authorities things. It's taught people who are campaigning for schools things. One of the things is we need to have a clear way of expressing information, which there can no longer be endless disputes about. So it's going well, and we'll certainly let you see it at the appropriate time with no difficulty at all.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Cabinet Secretary, in relation to the proposed 5-year moratorium before decisions can be revisited in terms of school closures, we heard from the previous panel diverse opinions on whether it should be 3 years or 5 years. Do you consider that the 5-year moratorium will encourage stability, or does it really come down to interference with the local council
No, it doesn't, in my view, and that will be a difference of opinion with others. It doesn't come down to interference at all. 5 years is a deliberate period chosen. It will be a different council that comes back to it, politically. No, it might not be. Everybody might be re-elected. So there will be a change in that period. So there's a political dimension to this. 5 years is a time between councils. So you've got that. But in addition, it's a practical thing. I mean, I know of schools that have had school closure proposals more than once, and it's a very debilitating experience. And it must be educational. It must be an educational disbenefit within those schools. If having got through a set of school closure proposals, at the end of that, to have discovered that there has been a reprieve, and then to discover in a year or 18 months that it's back on the agenda, is simply not good. And it's not good educationally. So I think it is entirely fair to put this in place, with a caveat, because there is a caveat, which is in special circumstances, and I think it would be unwise to define those too closely, but to say there are circumstances in which this can be revisited. I give the example of a building that has some problem with it or another. If in 2 years' time there was a discovery this building had a fault which meant the building would require to be replaced, that is a legitimate thing. And there will be many others. But I think it is a fair guarantee to give, and the timing is the right timing.
Thank you. We also heard from the panel that a major driving force behind some of these closures is really financial, or that was the allegation that was made. Do you think significant changes in financial circumstances, for example, the reductions in public sector funding, do you think that is a valid reason to revisit?
I think closures on individual rural schools must be made considering the circumstances of that rural school first and foremost. So in that reckoning, educational benefit is the key indicator for the pupils at that school. There will be a range of others, and of course the cost of keeping the school open in certain special circumstances, I've indicated one of them, certainly would be part of that equation. But at the heart of it, the overwhelming heart of it, must be the interests of the children who attend that school and the community in which the school is set. And I go back to the issue of financial information. The concept that there is a pot of gold which can be released by closing rural schools, whether it's 1 or 20, and applied elsewhere, is, in my view, usually a chimera.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. I declared an interest in front of the previous panel, but as a parent of a child who's at a school that was subject to proposal for closure, certainly understand the effect it has on the wider community, and also I think recognise the purpose behind the 5 years in terms of transitioning from one council to another. Nevertheless, I suppose any proposal for closure is going to at least look at the likely kind of pipeline of children coming up through nursery preschool in terms of arriving at any decision, and therefore even at 5 years there's perhaps a sense that, well, I've got a guarantee until my child gets to primary 3, 4, 5, but at that point there is a risk, and at a pretty critical stage in their education, that the proposal could come forward again. And certainly from my own personal experience, I understand not only the impact on staff and the wider community, but the children themselves who see it as somehow a failing on their part that their school is subject to these sorts of proposals. So, I mean, I understand the difficulties in arriving at any number, but actually that perhaps that 5-year moratorium doesn't necessarily get the community or the school out of the woods much more than it would were it set at 3 or 7 years.
I would be very happy to entertain a suggestion from Mr MacArthur. It went to 7 years. I mean, it's up to you. I thought we were being moderately reasonable in what we're doing, but there's an argument, logical argument. I mean, I'm not making a joke about this. There's a logical argument that says, the extension of school to a full school cohort, for example, might be the case. I think there is, the other thing I would say, in special circumstances, if a community found itself with a catastrophic drop in numbers, that would strike me as a special circumstance. But there's, of course, a grey area between them. And you're pointing it out well, which is that in some communities, the prospect of a closure leads parents to say, oh, well, we better move our kids to another school. And local authorities sometimes factor that into their consideration. You will get an attrition that some parents will simply say, well, let's go elsewhere. There are things, patterns change. I mean, if you look, for example, not in your constituency, but probably happens in your constituency, actually, I know it happens in Shetland, where you have commuting patterns that have changed. Where people perhaps will commute from a rural area into a town on a daily basis. It's sometimes easier to take the child to the school in the town than to have the child in a rural community where you might not have a family support structure of some sort. Now, that is a material circumstance you'd want to consider. But I would hope if there was a stability in a school that said, we're not going to close and we're open for 5 years, that would also create a confidence in the community and also would produce the effort in the community to endeavour to save it. That has happened quite dramatically, actually, in some school closure circumstances that I've seen, where it acts, and parents will tell you this, those who've been to rural schools to see this, it acts as a wake-up call. The people say, gosh, we think this is a great big school, but we need to do more as a community to protect it and to support it and to make sure there are more children going to it, and you get an increase. It'd be quite interesting to do a piece of work, actually, and look at a sample of schools that have been threatened with closure in the last 10 years to see whether the role has, and they've stayed open, to see whether the role has risen or fallen. And I suspect in many cases it will have risen because there is a renewed interest in that school. Finally, and I know I'm imposing upon you, Convener, but there's another issue too about rural school closures, which is some small schools that are accessible rural cater for special types of children. There'll be a high placing request that's in there. And it may well be that some parents, some parents find a smaller school with smaller classes, with perhaps a better wraparound care as being better for their children. So if you close particularly accessible rural schools, you actually diminish choice in communities. And sometimes that choice is very important. For example, if some individual children have support needs, and they're finding it difficult to see them met in larger schools, having the choice makes all the difference in rural communities from success or failure for those families. So there is a complexity to this which needs to be understood.
Point. I mean, for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not suggesting an extension from 5 to 7 years, but actually in terms of the 5 years, would it be your expectations that there would need to be a demonstration that circumstances had changed materially from 5 years previously, that hadn't simply been a kind of predictable trend and they revisited it on the basis of circumstances that were all well understood 5 years ago and we just go through the same process again?
The party would be entitled to bring forward a closure proposal without reference to previous proposals, but I'm sure the community would very quickly look at what they had done the last time and said the council predicted this then and that's what's happened. There are some rural schools I know where you look at the predictions that were made, schools that survived, and you think, thank goodness they survived because the predictions were utterly wrong in terms of demography in the community, in terms of number of children being available, either because the community has woken up and done something about it, or they were simply, the projections didn't add up even when they were made.
Liam MacArthur.
I am my own warm-up hag. You touched on this earlier on, Cabinet Secretary, but obviously the one recommendation that you weren't prepared to accept from the Commission was recommendation 20. You've, I think, hinted at the rationale behind that. I think what we heard from the first panel was a concern in terms of distinguishing between educational quality and educational benefit, and that, in a sense, the latitude for trying to take forward proposals on the basis of safeguarding the quality of educational provision for children should be very much, and is very much, at the forefront of the thinking of officials and elected members at a local level. But that without this, the bar being set that bit higher in terms of securing positive educational benefit, there is a risk that debates around closure proposals continue to be very, very polarised, and it's very difficult to build a consensus around a way forward.
We're leaving the bar where it is, rather than raising it higher or putting it lower. And of course I thought very long and hard about this, because this is the only recommendation I couldn't accept. But it is, of course, the only split recommendation. It was not unanimous. And I think that is interesting in itself. I've seen a lot of school closure proposals over the years. I think members know I've got a particular interest in this and a particular concern for this, as many rural members will have, and those who have lived for a long time in rural communities. And I've seen some pretty contentious debates on this. One of the most alarming things I've seen is assertions about educational outcomes which are highly questionable. Assertions, for example, that CFE cannot be delivered below a certain number of pupils. Things that actually have no educational validity at all. And fears in some people that if a class is 6, 10, 12, there will be a strong educational disbenefit in being in smaller schools. And I think one of my key objectives is to cut through that type of information and to be absolutely clear without doubt that there will be a benefit to the individual child in what is taking place. And I think if that benefit cannot be proved, then it is a disadvantage to that individual child, and by extension to the family, and by extension to the entire community, and the decision should not be made. And I think that is absolutely central to how we see education being delivered. Where we can, we should strive as much as possible to ensure that benefit is always at the centre of our decision-making. And therefore, it was a difficult discussion in the Commission. It was obviously one area where there was a lots of differing opinions. And I have come down clearly on the side of the minority report because I believe that that is the right thing to do.
There was a point made, again this morning, I think referencing the Commission's chair himself, suggesting that there was often as much divergence in quality within schools as between schools, and therefore actually in terms of the of securing that benefit, the proposal to merge schools isn't necessarily the threat that is often perceived. And there are examples of where mergers are taking place and benefits have clearly been delivered. How straightforward it would have been to express those benefits kind of ahead of time, I think it was recognised as a challenge. But this is clearly an area where you believe that we need to stick to the guns.
Yeah, I mean, I think we assess the quality of a school and the educational advantage of a school by an inspection of a school. This is what we do, and there are a set of indicators within a whole school, right? I do accept that quality can change in various parts of the school. And indeed, on the issue of attainment, we see attainment gaps even in individual schools, let alone elsewhere. Though I'm sure members will be happy to note this morning the progress that we've made is, according to the PISA results, in closing the attainment gap, further closing the attainment gap in Scotland. I think you have to have a definition that works somewhere. Our definition is the whole school. I think you have to make an assessment of the whole school and what the whole school is contributing. And if there is disbenefit in closing that school to the individual pupils, then I think you can see that clearly. Education Scotland plays a role in that. The argument that the local authority will address specifically that issue. And then I think you make a judgment upon it. But at the end, that is a decision that parents and communities will look at. And we need to help them with the right definitions, but they will be the judge of whether or not there is benefit or disbenefit, because they will know what they're looking at.
I think in their evidence suggests that educational quality is the prime motive in the consideration of the school estate at all times. What, though, would be your understanding of the role of financial criteria in any decision to bring forward a proposal for closure?
I think I've made that clear in the previous answer. Educational benefit is essentially the touchstone of the decision. There are financial considerations that run below that, but those financial considerations should be specific to the school and should not be overwhelming. Now, local authority will have some financial views, and those are of relevance, but again, I counsel local authorities not to think that this is a way in which you can solve a lot of problems, because the outcomes, the real outcomes of school closure processes hardly ever produce the savings or the sums that are expected.
Do you believe that financial criteria have a...
They are a subordinate standard. They are not the standard for this. But of course, they're in there. Of course, a local authority will argue. It's entitled to argue. But the reason for closing a school has to be educational benefit.
Secretary, I think one of the reasons why some people are concerned about educational benefit is because, not that they're against it, it's just it's very hard to define. Yeah. Apart from an inspection report, which is obviously the main way that feedback is given to parents, could you say what other criteria you think parents would want to make a judgment about educational benefit and therefore be able to define it?
It is an interesting one. The local authority must say why an educational benefit will arise. So they have to define it, essentially. I can't define it for every school. I think it would be wrong to do so. They have to say that benefit is there, and this is it. And they have to be able to prove that that is the case, and parents will want to look at that very critically. But if I can give you an example, just drawn at random from some of the school closures that I've known about, if you have a small school that has been outstanding in previous inspection reports, absolutely outstanding in those reports, and is one of the best schools in the area, or the local authority area, or in Scotland, and the proposal is in some way that the quality and benefit from that education could be increased by being merged with another and larger school, whose inspection reports are less good, that would raise a very strong question mark in the mind of the parents in the community as to whether there was an educational benefit in so doing. Now, if there were holes in the roof, and if there was some enormous problem with the building and other things, there could be an argument to say that we can improve the overall educational experience and benefit of every child by so doing. But when those arguments aren't there, that's going to be a tough one for authorities to sell, and they are the ones who have to sell it, because they are the ones who are making the proposal.
The onus is on the local authority. Right, okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Neil Bibby.
In the previous session, Cabinet Secretary Eileen Pryor called for clarity on what is defined as a rural school. I just wanted to ask you, should there be a reclassification of what rural schools are? For example, I attended Kilbarchan Primary School in Renfrewshire, which I don't think Kilbarchan would necessarily see as a rural area. And that's maybe down to historical reasons rather than post-war demographic changes. So basically just ask you, what would your response to be to Eileen?
We're sort of Kilbarchan as a sort of rural place. I'm sure you do too. There are anomalies, but the Commission did not recommend a redefinition. The definition is complex. It is applied according to a wider Scottish Government definition. But Recommendation 37, which the Government has accepted, says the current definition of a rural school should not be altered. And indeed, COSLA has accepted that too. The Scottish Government should carry out a narrow and restricted review in conjunction with local authorities to address any anomalies that arise from the current definition. If you're proposing Kilbarchan as part of that review, I'm sure we'll consider it. But there are a number of anomalies we could address. But the view of the Commission unanimously was that should not be revisited.
I obviously just wanted to raise that point with you. Can I ask you also, can you provide information on any additional costs associated with the implementation of the proposed amendments to the 2010 Act?
Bring forward information in the financial memorandum that will give you that information. We do not regard them as significant, I have to say, but we'll bring forward, of course, bring forward information. That's what we will do with the amendments.
Can I just finish the session this morning, Cabinet Secretary, with a general question? I mean, clearly, do you agree that school closures are just one of those things that are inherently controversial and that no legislation will ever remove that controversy?
If I say yes to that, the last hour and a half would have been in vain. I don't agree that that's true. I think that school closures are always, and I said in my opening statement, first sentence of it was they're always going to be difficult and they're always going to be contentious. I am an optimist. I do believe it is possible to get circumstances in which agreement is reached. I think we've had some, and actually we can get more of them. But if the legislation isn't working, then it is our job as legislators to make it work. We have advice from the courts on how that should be done. I think the discussion we've had today has been very positive and will lead to an improvement, and I'm quite sure that Lorraine will take away these in terms of drafting and thinking of the actual wording, and I make a commitment, to, as I've made all throughout, to be open to ideas from the committee as we do that. But I think we are not here in vain, and we'll keep working on it.
Cabinet Secretary very much for coming along this morning and providing evidence on these proposed amendments to the Children and Young People Bill, and also thank the officials for being here. Can I ask you just to stay in your place for one moment just while we do the final item on the agenda, if you don't mind, rather than suspend? Because our last item today is to consider the Fundable Bodies Scotland Order 2013. The order updates the list of bodies that may receive funding for their role in relation to further and higher education. Do members have any comments on this instrument? Okay, therefore, does the committee agree to make no recommendation to the Parliament on the instrument? Thank you very much. That concludes our meeting. Our next meeting will be on the 10th of December, when we will take evidence on outdoor learning. I close the meeting. Thank you.